Good morning. This is the 16th of August, and we are starting up with Adult Forum again. Omar Cisneros, our seminarian, and this is his last Sunday at St. Dunstan's before going back to Virginia Seminary, where he and his wife Karina will be for the next year. And we are starting our Gospel Challenge today. And what we're doing is we're issuing and accepting the challenge to read through all four Gospels and the book of Acts. Acts and Luke go together. And ultimately what we'd really like people to do is to try to read each gospel in one sitting. Now the first one happens to be the shortest, so that's the easiest one to do that in, but it gives you a different perspective if you look at it all in one go. And but if that's too much, there are also ways to listen to it online. And I have been posting a link to the actor David Suchet reading it from St. Paul's Cathedral. Omar has a recording that he really likes.
Yeah, I really like the Johnny Cash version of him reading the different Gospels in the New Testament. It's phenomenal. I mean, it's Johnny Cash, so I've really enjoyed it.
Do you get that on YouTube?
Yeah, you can find it on YouTube, and he is, he uses that smooth voice of his to read the Gospel, and it's phenomenal. It's my favorite reading of the Gospel.
Well, and there's James Earl Jones reading the Gospel, too. You can get that. So, anyway, so there are different ways to find that on YouTube. But then you may just want to read it out of your Bible at home. And one of the things that we just wanted to do a little public service announcement about this morning is the translations we choose to read. So in the Episcopal Church, we have authorized scriptures that we're allowed to use, authorized versions of scripture we're allowed to use for various services. At St. Dunstan's, we read from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which came from the Revised Standard Version, which the New Revised Standard Version came out in the late 80s. Some Episcopal churches use the King James Version of the Bible, but the translation we use makes a difference. Some of them are more scholarly than others. Some of them are translated from a certain point of view. The New International Version is very popular, but it's very popular with evangelicals because it's translated from an evangelical viewpoint. So the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, was thought to be more scholarly, but translated in a little bit of a more neutral way with good language. The new part of it, when we got the New Revised Standard Version, was that they went in and they made the pronouns that you were able to make gender neutral without changing the meaning of the text. They changed those, and or they might change, say, brethren to people, or brothers and sisters, or something like that. Some people don't like those changes, so they just want to stick to the RSV. But and then we also have paraphrases of Scripture. You may remember the Good News Bible was a paraphrase from the 70s, and the Message by Eugene Peterson is a very popular paraphrase. Now, the thing to remember is when you have a paraphrase, it would be like, I've read the Gospels at some point, and now I'm telling you the story in my own words. So I may change a few things, possibly. What about Alan and Omar? What do you think about Bible translations?
I know from just being in seminary that some people in certain denominations prefer Bibles from a certain period because somehow they believe that they are earthier, or just the traditional translations of the Bible are better. However, one of the things that scholarship has done, maybe I think in the last 20, 30 years, is just improve upon the translations of manuscripts that we've had for hundreds of years, for 1,000 years sometimes. And so what happens is that there's been new discoveries in scholarship that has made new translations be more faithful to the original manuscripts, which is something that is, sounds almost contradictory to say the new versions of old manuscripts are better, but they actually are.
Yeah, I think we're constantly learning. We're constantly growing in this thing. I mean, I prefer, when I read just for my own reading, I prefer the New American Standard, because I just like the flow of it. But if I'm going to preach, I'm not going to preach out of just the New American Standard. I'm going to do some research into the actual meaning of certain words and try to find the depth of them as it's been understood traditionally across the board.
Right.
So yeah, but the different translations, and some people, the good news, it's easier for them to comprehend or to take in. It touches them in a different way, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to get really technical and scholarly about where all these things come from, then you need to do a little bit of research. But whatever translation works for you and brings you closer to God, just keep using it. That's what I do.
That's true. You get very nerdy on translation.
You can.
And there's all these little nerdy books in seminary that you could buy at home. Metzger's Committee that just goes through just about every little translation controversy in the New Testament in the Greek, and there's a book that is a companion to Metzger's book, and you can just go on and on and on and on and on. But most interpretations are very, very solid. Yeah.
Yeah.
But good manuscripts and good translation done in committee, as opposed to one or two people translating the New Testament, which is not the way it should be done, by the way.
So I have a quote about the Gospel of Mark from N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is a scholar and a bishop in the Church of England. He was the Bishop of Durham, and he's now a professor at St. Andrews University in Scotland. And he's written prolifically about the New Testament. And this is what he has to say about the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Gospel is the shortest and sharpest of the early stories about Jesus. Many people think Mark's Gospel was the first to be written. And certainly it has all the zip and punch of a quick story that's meant to grab you by the collar and make you face the truth about Jesus, about God, and about yourself. There's a sense of urgency in the Gospel of Mark. We find the word immediately many times in the first 2 chapters and several times after that. Early in chapter 1, the main theme of Jesus' ministry is articulated. God's kingdom is arriving. The kingdom of God is at hand. Something momentous is happening. Be alert. The train is about to leave the station. Jump on board before it's too late. So, just off the top of your head, not getting too scholarly, but what do you think about when you think about the Gospel of Mark?
I think I appreciate its earthiness and its closest, maybe, actual truth to the ministry of Jesus Christ, because it's the earliest of the Gospels. I don't know if that was too wonky.
Now, the thing I've always been, it's intriguing to me about the Gospel of Mark is just, it's flashbang. It's flashbang. It's one story, one episode, on to the next, and it's a quickly read, and Mark just moves the ministry and the passion of Christ very rapidly, much more so than I think the other Gospels do.
But it's not your favorite.
No, I'm sorry. My favorite is the Gospel of Luke.
It's not my favorite either. I don't know. I'm not sure I know anybody whose favorite Gospel is Mark, but if it is, let us know.
It's my favorite.
Oh, that's right. He just said that, didn't he? Sorry, Omar.
No.
He hasn't even loved it, and I've already forgotten. Just kidding. Just kidding. Never forget Omar. Yeah. So, let's see. So, one of the earliest readers of the Gospel was St. Ignatius of Antioch. And St. Ignatius of Antioch, he died in the year around 110. So, not very long after Jesus was here. He was born a little bit after Jesus was on earth. And so, Ignatius came from Antioch. He was captured by the Romans and taken under guard to Rome, where he was tossed to the lions. And he knew that was going to be his fate. And he wrote, "I flee to the gospel as to the flesh of Jesus Christ." So what he meant was that the Gospels don't merely tell him about Jesus, but bring him into the living contact of Jesus. They are, in a sense, his real presence. And if we think about, this is somebody who only lived, 1 or 2 generations after the time that Christ was on earth. The Gospels already meant so much to him and to other Christians at that point. I think sometimes we get lost in the idea that they happened so long ago, and they, what it meant to people back then was something tremendous. Yeah, Homer's telling me I'm advancing my
Yeah.
slides in the wrong direction. Dating, not going on a date, but the date of the gospel. So Mark is thought to be the earliest continuous narrative that we have of Jesus that survived, and most scholars date it to around the year 70. It's one of the synoptic gospels. Synoptic comes from the words meaning seen together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the three synoptic gospels, and you can lay them out in columns and see where they overlap. Alan talked about a book about that earlier.
Yeah, it's a book I know that's out of print, but you can find it if you do a search on the internet. It's called Gospels Parallel, and the author is, the last name is Throckmorton. And as you open each page, it starts with each synoptic from chapter 1 all the way to the very end, and you can read what's included and what's left out, what's been added in certain gospels that Mark doesn't have or Luke has that Matthew doesn't have. And so you can kind of compare the progression of our tradition.
90% of the Gospel of Mark is included in Luke and Matthew, and they draw heavily on Mark. The earliest copy, the earliest manuscript we have of Mark is dated to the 4th century. Now, Omar said something earlier that was really interesting about biblical manuscripts. Remember what you said?
Yeah, so thank you, Marianne. So something about the Gospel of Mark is that it was probably, so first of all, the Gospel of Mark for a long time in the church, especially in the early church, and in the early years of what we know as the Roman Catholic Church, it wasn't liked. It wasn't well received because the scholars and the authors of that time, the scribes felt that it was an inferior version of better versions of the gospel. So what they did is that they would actually they would scrape off the Gospel of Mark on the actual manuscript,
The vellum?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and then they would write other gospels on top of it. And so with modern technology, we were able to kind of scan these documents and realize that, for example, you would read the Gospel of Matthew, and under that gospel you could see the writings of the Gospel of Mark that were scratched out at one point. And so but however, now in kind of modern times, the Gospel of Mark has kind of become more prominent because people feel that it is the closest thing to the life of Jesus Christ. It's the earliest one, therefore it was probably less influenced by the scribes and the copyists. So it's kind of seen as the earthiest and the most authentic of the gospel. So it's a very interesting story how the gospel has gone from being kind of like not well liked, not well received, to just being kind of the preeminent of the gospels because of its closeness in time to Jesus Christ. But it's my favorite for that reason, because and it's also it's written as if it was said in an oral tradition, and that's why the gospel is so quick, and then he went, and it's just it's really fast immediately, because it was being said probably for the first 60 years orally, and it was heard orally, and it wasn't written down until the disciples of Jesus Christ realized that maybe Jesus isn't coming in the next 70, 80 years, so we should probably write some of this stuff down. Some of the things he said should be written down so we don't forget.
That's right.
Yeah. And then, go ahead.
No. Oh, okay. Well, and then so the who was Mark written for? That's a question. Now, a lot of the information I'm giving you, is pretty traditional, and it's ideas that are more widely accepted. There are all kinds of ideas and scholarship and things that clash with others, and so I'm sticking to sort of the mainstream ideas about this. Mark was probably written as a missionary book for those who knew little about the Christian faith, and it's been hinted at that the audience very likely could have been Roman. And the reason why is that in the other Gospels, the Gospels tend to refer more to the Jewish law and to the Hebrew Scriptures, and there's very little reference to that in Mark. I think there's only one quote from Hebrew Scriptures. There are references to wild beasts and persecutions, which would make sense if you think about a Roman audience reading this. And there are several Latin borrow words in this gospel, like legion, praetorian, centurion, and the names of various coins. So it's highly likely that the people that were going to be reading this were Roman. The structure of the book, it's, as we said, it's the shortest gospel, and it's, is it 18 chapters? I think it's 18 chapters. I don't know for sure.
We could look here.
We could look, but it's 16 to 18 chapters. Halfway through the book, the emphasis shifts from the crowds to the disciples, and the midpoint story in this is the Transfiguration. So Jesus is in Galilee with his disciples, and he's passed through Samaria and all these things, and it goes up to the Mount of the Transfiguration, and then comes back down and goes to Jerusalem. And so that is a big turning point, because the last half of the gospel is the last week of Jesus' life, culminating in the crucifixion. And so it's interesting that the Transfiguration is the turning point of the story. Some scholars say that Mark is the story of the Passion with a really, really long introduction. So.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Stylistically, it's composed of short and simple sentences, not unlike a newspaper account. It focuses on events, not speeches or editorial comments. It gives just a sampling of the parables. It's bare bones drama, and Mark tells a story in a rush, as we've been saying. All the characters are in a hurry. So when you read it, pay attention to the words and phrases that get used a lot, like at once, immediately, amazed, astounded, terrified, released, be raised. They're kind of words that pack a punch. And it's the only gospel that uses Aramaic, the idiom that Jesus spoke, at key points. So words and phrases like Talitha kum, which means little girl, arise. And this is the one we were talking about earlier. We have a hard time saying
Ephata.
Ephata. Be open. Alan, you say the rest. He's really good at Aramaic.
Oh, and then of course the term Abba and Elohi.
See, he does that on Good Friday when he reads the Passion Gospel. He always gets to say that part. An interesting thing about this gospel is, and this is from an author, Marie Sabin, who wrote the Gospel According to Mark commentary from the New Collegeville Bible Commentaries. Genesis is always in the background of Mark. Mark thinks about God in terms of the Creator, whose primary concern is to create, sustain, and restore life. So the gospel is structured around the idea that God wants us to get back to the garden, back to paradise, back to the nature restored.
Yeah, and then another thing, when other writers of the different gospels, when they looked at Mark for inspiration, a lot of what they did is actually smooth out the language, make it a little more, polish it up, and because the Gospel of Mark in its original Greek is actually very choppy. It's not very well written, to be honest, and the language isn't as beautiful as opposed to maybe the Gospel of John. And so, for example, Matthew, that draws heavily on Mark, what they did is just say, yeah, this is good, but how can we make this flow better? It took Mark from maybe a B paper to an A paper in Matthew. So I find that very fascinating.
So who wrote it? That's another question. When we talk about who wrote various parts of Scripture in the New Testament, there are some things that we can be pretty confident about, and there are other things we can't. We just have to make educated guesses. We can be pretty certain that there are epistles that Paul wrote. There are other epistles that maybe somebody wrote after listening to Paul. There are other letters, which is what epistle means. There are other letters that are clearly not written by Paul, but sometimes we attribute them to him because we're so used to saying the according to Paul. And not everything in the New Testament after the Gospels is according to Paul, but who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Again, I try to err on the side of what's a more traditional view, and I do, but I think sometimes we ought to think about this. Occam's razor, which says the simplest answer is often the right one. I mean, even people doing detective work will say, you know what, sometimes the answer to solve this mystery is the simplest answer is often the right one. There is somebody who is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles and the first letter of Peter, whose name was John Mark. He traveled for a while with Paul and Barnabas, I think it was Barnabas, and left. He went AWOL, and they weren't happy, or they split. They they weren't happy about the whole thing. And then he became a companion of Peter or a follower of Peter, and he's mentioned in the Bible. According to the ancient tradition, he was a disciple of Simon Peter, who wrote his gospel based on Peter's teaching in Rome, or preaching in Rome. And what's interesting is this is mentioned in a lot of early Christian writings. So from the first 200 years of Christianity, this is talked about, that who wrote the Gospel of Mark. The earliest one is a fellow named Papias, who apparently collected a lot of early church manuscripts together, which likely have been lost in the meantime, but he lived from the year 60 to about the year 140, and he was a third generation Christian. And he wrote this about the Gospel of Mark. He said, "This also, the elder John used to say," this also, I'm not sure what I'm saying here. Okay. "When Mark became Peter's interpreter, he wrote down accurately, though not by no means in order, as much as he remembered of the words and deeds of the Lord, for he had neither heard the Lord, nor been in his company, but subsequently joined Peter." So this is somebody who's not an eyewitness to the gospel, but he's a follower of an eyewitness to the gospel, right?
So was Paul.
And so, yeah, that's right.
And it's also like it's interesting that, in 70 years, I mean, those who had witnessed Jesus with their own eyes were probably children who either had grown old. So, we think of the time of Jesus' ministry to the 70s, it's easily 2 generations. And you got to remember, people lived shorter lifespans in those times. So it's really a 2-generation gap between Jesus and his the authors of the Gospel of Mark, which I think is pretty cool. That imagining somebody as a child seeing Jesus and then retelling his story as he grew older. So there's just a lot of richness in that early church period, and you see that a bit in the Gospel of Mark.
Well, and if you think about 2 generations, so if my grandmother tells me stories about my great-grandmother, they could be embellished, or they could be incorporating family lore, but they could very likely be true. So she tells me the story about how her mother and father eloped and took a buggy, or got on a train and went to Vincennes, Indiana to get married. I can with very confidently say my great-grandmother got married in Vincennes, Indiana. Now there may be other details about that story that aren't true. We can put a pin in that. We might go back to that, but if you think about the oral tradition in those days, it was much more robust than what we have now too. People told those stories over and over and over. And
they were taught ways to memorize this. And there's actually this guy who actually did a TED Talk, who went back to these kind of the Greek orators that learned how to memorize things, and practiced it so much that he actually won a memorization contest just from practicing those ancient Greek practices. So definitely it was a stronger oral tradition in those times.
Yes.
Let's see. So we heard from Papias. Clement of Alexandria, who lived from 150 to 215, said, as Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome and declared the gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered well what he had said, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly hindered nor encouraged it. Similar testimony is given by Irenaeus, who lived from 115 to 202, a disciple of Polycarp who knew the Apostle John, by Tertullian, by Origen, and this diverse testimony comes from areas as far-flung as France, North Africa, not North America, that'd be amazing, Palestine and Turkey. And it's weighty evidence that Peter was indeed Mark's primary source of information about the life of Jesus. So, I think we like to, I don't know if it's so much true anymore, but for a while in the church we really got intrigued by skepticism. But I don't think things necessarily need to be written off because they're traditional. Like I said, the testimony of my grandmother about my great-grandmother, there's a lot of detail in it that we can take for fact. So.
Yeah, and I can look to my own immigrant story and tell you all these crazy stories about people and whether they're true or not. Who knows? But I think, I think it was best explained by my New Testament professor who said, we could completely discard everything that's said in the Gospels, or we can take everything as, no pun intended, gospel truth, right? But somehow the truth, I think, is somewhere in the middle, and I think we have to kind of respect that there is some basis of reality, and maybe there are some things that were embellished by the scribes, but I think the truth is somewhere in between those two realities, and especially in that kind of that scholarship side of things with the Gospel of Mark and the New Testament.
Yeah. I was just looking up something. That's why you heard some sounds. But one of the things I wasn't 100% sure on, so I had to look it up. But if the Gospel of Mark supposedly, let's say around 70 A.D., there was something that significantly happened prior to that, and something that happened on that very same year, that I think Mark may have found some urgency in the need to write as quick as he could, as succinctly as he could. Nero had just got through persecuting the Christians and the Jews in Rome for torching half of the city. And that was, and at 70 AD, the temple was utterly rent and destroyed, and Jerusalem was laid waste to. So the people that were Christians in Jerusalem were scattered without anything other than their oral tradition. So I think, there's conjecture on my part that Mark wrote something to get down quickly, to get disseminated to people who needed to hear about this man Jesus in the midst of all the trauma they were experiencing.
And also, I think it's important to note that the early church writers never expected for one gospel to be next to other three gospels, and for the New Testament to be compiled the way it is. And so, and that in itself is kind of an argument against literalism, Bible literalism, that to say that these things were not written to be in conversation with each other as closely as we have done it in the last, 1600 years. And so that's a very powerful statement about how the canon came to be. And we have a lot of manuscripts and different gospels that were not included in the canon of faith. And it's important to understand that, and understand that there's an intention behind these early Christians and these bishops of putting things together. I read once in a very Catholic book about the Eucharist, about how these books were compiled exclusively to be read during the Mass. And so there is something about that, and I think it's important that we recognize that, and how much even the Protestant reformers reflected on each gospel, and how they valued certain books over others. And it's just really cool. It's really interesting to see that trajectory that the church has taken, and you can go on and on about the epistles and all these things, but that's very interesting stuff.
So going back to this gospel challenge, one of the reasons for it is that I was asked, somebody had asked me earlier this summer about a book about Jesus that wasn't the Bible, and I shared one by N.T. Wright that I appreciate called Simply Jesus. But the Gospels really are the best way for us to know Jesus. In the same way that St. Ignatius of Antioch felt Jesus present in the Gospels, that can happen for us too. And that's why reading them in one sitting, if possible, or if you have to take a break halfway through, it's understandable, but trying to read them in one sitting or listening to it in one sitting, gives us a little bit different perspective and maybe a fuller picture than if we read little snippets and then do a lot of studying in between. So, but that said, there are some things to reflect on while you're reading or listening. You will notice that there are stories in the Gospel of Mark that are not included ones that you will read in Matthew or Luke. You'll notice that, and you might wonder about that. Just make a note of it, put a pin in it, as I said earlier. So, you know, just think about what seems to be missing, but then what's included. And why, given what we do know about Mark, why do we think these things were included? Or why, you know, if you were an early Christian, why would you think these things might be included? You might also look at what kind of eyewitness details stand out to you. One of the interesting things that people have noted about Mark is that they're really kind of interesting, very specific details that are not necessarily integral to the story, but they're included. And it's likely because it was just something that Peter said, and so the person writing this down, if it was Mark, thought it should be included. So let's go back to my great-grandma. So great-grandma says, my grandmother says about my great-grandma, well, you know, her brother hid her bag under the porch, and it was purple, and he hid it under the porch along with a ladder, and then they put the ladder up to the window and got her out of the window and got the bag and got onto the train. Why do we need to know the bag is purple? We don't. But for some reason, great-grandma remembered the bag was purple, and when she would tell the story, she'd tell my grandma, and my grandma just had that in her head that the bag was purple, and she tells a story like that. So you'll notice some things like that, I think, and just, again, put a pin in it, and we'll talk about these questions next week when we're doing our Zoom call with folks, and just make a note of anything else that stands out with you. I mean, our Zoom meeting. We'll do a Zoom meeting at 9:45. But we're going to be trying to record the parts of us discussing, so we don't run into some of the problems that we have with trying to do a live stream and a Zoom and PowerPoint and all at the same time. Do y'all have anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I think the Johnny Cash version is the best version to listen to.
I want to hear James Earl Jones say, Jesus, I am your father. Anyway, Alan, you have anything?
No, I'm just. Did you go through this whole list of questions?
Did you
Pretty
see some
much.
missing?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Okay. I'll send the questions out, this PowerPoint out on email, and you'll also be able to watch it online with this recording. We're thanking Chaz Emerson, who's again behind the camera.
Yeah.
This morning we said Chaz makes this stuff look a lot easier than it is, and we really appreciate all that he does for us. So that's Deacon Allen and Seminarian Omar and Mother Marianne signing off. Have a good day.
Thank you.